right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. For those who it might be your first time joining us, we are all about bringing science, exploration, adventure, and conservation live into classrooms across North America and beyond. So each month, we host anywhere from 30, 40, even 50 live events, connecting scientists, explorers, adventurers, and conservationists to classrooms. So check out exploringbytheseat.com to see all the events we have coming up and to register to tune in live or to jump into one of our camera spots. So it's been a busy day today. Today we've been celebrating World Migratory Bird Day. We've been talking to scientists and explorers from all around the world who are studying bird migration, who are studying some of the hazards that they face and trying to figure out what impacts things like global warming might be having on migratory birds. So we're going to join now Dr. Christian Artuso. He is a conservationist and ornithologist with the Migratory Birds Division of the Canadian Wildlife Services, and this is with Environment and Climate Change Canada. He's particularly focused on the conservation of migratory birds in grassland ecosystems. He has trained many young biologists in field methods and identifying birds. And in his spare time, he loves to travel and take photos of wildlife. So he's photographed over 4,000 species of birds, including some first known photographs of rare species. So pretty darn cool. Christian, I'm going to bring you in live here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Joe. And can everyone hear me okay?
You're coming in loud and clear. Perfect.
Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about grassland conservation. I think and a little bit about the relationship between agriculture and conservation of the environment or biodiversity. And of course, I focus on migratory birds, being an ornithologist and being what I know best, but this applies more broadly. Now, I was told I should start by talking a little bit about myself, so I'm going to start by doing that. So basically, I grew up loving birds. I don't really know why, but I was always fascinated by wildlife of all types. And I've been extremely lucky in my life, in two ways. One is that I've been able to turn my fascination with birds into a career as well as a hobby. So I'm one of those people who, when I stop work at 5 o'clock, I go and do more of the same thing just for fun, which, I think is really a lucky break. And secondly, I've had a really great chance to travel, and I have visited lots of countries. You can see that little map in the top right there. And as Joe mentioned, I've seen more than half of the world's bird species in my travels. Got to see some really cool places, some very remote places, some really extremely remote places, in fact, and learned a lot about wildlife and birds and even languages and cultures along the way. So I do a lot of this type of talking and public speaking. I also have, done a lot of media work and so on. I've actually been on television in 4 different languages talking about birds and their conservation. So it's pretty much, what I talk about a lot. And then more recently, I do a fair bit of social media as well, also trying to basically breach these themes of biodiversity and the conservation of biodiversity and so on and so forth. And these are all my photos in this presentation, by the way. And as you probably get a hint, I'm a little bit obsessed with owls, one of my particular favorite families from that. I also love backcountry and getting in a canoe and exploring Canada's wilderness. I've had the good fortune to travel to northern Canada. That's me in the middle bottom, standing on Hudson Bay, up in Nunavut or the Manitoba-Nunavut border. And there's nothing I love more than being out in some really remote wilderness. But interestingly enough, although I was born in Eastern Canada in Montreal, when I came to Manitoba, which is right in the middle of Canada, to do my PhD, and I did my PhD there on the eastern screech owl, and I did some other research on other owls in Manitoba. I also started to learn a lot about prairie ecosystems, and that has become quite an obsession of late. I was able to coordinate a couple of big projects in my time in Manitoba, and this one here that's on your screen right now is called the Manitoba Breeding Bird Atlas. And this basically documents the distribution of all the species that nest in the province of Manitoba. That's why it's called breeding birds. And just to show you how much of that province of Manitoba, which is Manitoba has a lot of wilderness. The northern part of Manitoba has very few roads. Most of the squiggly lines that you see on this map are canoe routes that we paddled in order to survey the birds of Manitoba over a 5-year period. And each one of those squares, blue or yellow or green, is 10 by 10 kilometers, just to give you a sense of the scale here. So each little blue pixel is 10 by 10 kilometers, or 6 by 6 miles if you're in the US and prefer to use miles. So that's a lot of remote surveying of birds, and if you're in northern Manitoba, very cold climate, 90% of those are migratory birds. But the thing that I wanted to talk about today, because I think it's really extremely important, is a little bit about the grasslands or the prairie. You've probably heard the word prairie before, and we usually use it to refer to the central grasslands of North America. These are, as a habitat, as an ecosystem, grasslands are arguably either the most or certainly one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world. That's not just true in North America, that's true in other continents as well. Grasslands are a type of ecosystem that, unfortunately, it's quite easy to convert into other things. So they tend to get ripped up and they tend to get underappreciated a bit, but they're actually extremely important. And when I came to Manitoba, well, before I came to Manitoba, there were birds like this long-bill curlew in Manitoba. Long-bill curlew is now considered to be extirpated in Manitoba. And extirpated is just a fancy word for extinct at a local level. So it doesn't occur there anymore. And there's other species like, maybe you can see a little blob on a fence post there. That's this bird, the burrowing owl. That's an adult and a baby there. The adult with the burrowing, the baby with the plainer belly there. They are almost gone from the province of Manitoba now, just a couple of pairs left. So this, when I arrived in Manitoba, became something that really consumed a lot of my time and thought, and got me involved in grassland conservation. And I just, again, so I understand we have students from almost east to west across the continent today, which is fantastic. So you can hopefully relate yourself to this map of North America, I hope. You can see the Great Lakes, and you, I hope, can this is just a satellite map from Google Earth, but you should be able to recognize the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts. And I think we have some students from Wyoming who would be on the western side, and some students from the east as well. Anyway, the color coding in the middle of this map represents the Great Plains. So this is just to give you some context of the area. And the yellow shaded area is what we call tall grass prairie. In the eastern edge of the prairie system, it's a bit taller, as the name suggests. The pink is what we call mixed grass prairie, and the green is what we call short grass prairie. But basically, that is the extent of the prairie ecosystem. And it actually has a very important position right in the middle of the continent, separating the east from the west. If you're in the east, it's more forest, and if you're in the west, it's more forest, although there are grasslands in the east and the west. For example, the Central Valley of California over here would be an example of another grassland. So it's not grasslands. This is not the only area with grasslands, but it is the biggest contiguous area of grassland. And getting to the migratory birds, there are a bunch of migratory birds that complete their life cycle in that geography. So these are typical range maps. I'm hoping that you've seen range maps before, know a little bit of how to interpret them. When it comes to migratory birds, often there's a color coding around breeding and non-breeding, and sometimes there's a color coding around migration in between. So in these three cases, three species from left to right, Sprague's pipit, chestnut-colored longspur, and Baird sparrow. The blue blob, which is in the northern US states and southern Canada, that's the breeding range of these birds. And the orange blob at the bottom, which is mostly in Mexico and Texas, very southern US, that is where they spend the winter. So there's a lot of these grassland birds, because they need grassland and because that's where the grass is mostly, that they complete their whole life cycle within the Great Plains. Now there's a few others that go down to South America. There's some grasslands in South America called pampas. So there's a few other birds that nest in our grasslands that go all the way to South America. But there's many that complete their whole life cycle in North America in this way. And these birds are all in real trouble. The chestnut-colored longspur that you see in the middle there has lost 90% of its population, and others are in that 80 to 90% ballpark. So since we started the breeding bird survey in the mid-1960s, and in Canada especially early 1970s, in that span of 50 years or so, they've lost up to 90% of their population. So they're in real trouble, in real need of conservation. And interestingly, though, there's a bit of a paradox with these birds, and that is they evolved with grasslands, and the big the big grazing animal on the grasslands would have been bison once upon a time. So not so very long ago, we had millions and millions of bison that were grazing these grasslands, and the birds basically evolved over time a relationship with grazing. That's why you might hear people talk about ecosystem processes, or you might even hear people talk about ecosystem services. If you hear those words, they refer to things that basically change or allow ecosystems to operate. So fire can be one, drought can be one, but also grazing or herbivory, to use a fancy word. So when a deer eats the leaves of a tree, we call that browsing. And when a big animal like a bison eats the grass, we call that grazing. And where the grazing is very heavy, which is on the left-hand side of this picture, there's a bunch of birds that like that really short grass. And where the grazing is very light, which is on the right-hand side of this picture, there's a bunch of birds that use those habitats there. And interestingly, plants and animals have lived with each other for a very long time. And I just want to illustrate that relationship a little bit. This, Joe, is where I have a question for the students. Let's see how they do this. So let's say, for example, if you had a rose bush or something, a plant like that, that you really wanted to nourish and to see it grow strongly, what would you do for that rose bush?
Okay. Let's join Miss Frengen's group. What would you do if you wanted to see a plant like a rose bush grow really strongly? What kind of things would you do?
What would you do, Summer?
I would help it grow. I would help it grow by watering it like every day.
Okay. Did you guys hear that?
That sounds like water every day.
Great answer.
Water every day.
What else?
What would you guys do to the rose bush? For the rose bush. Naomi? Make sure it got some sun.
Yeah, wonderful.
Jethro? Think of the soil. What would you do for the soil? What does soil mean? Jethro?
You have to change the soil.
Well, if it was potted, we might want to refresh that soil every now and then. But what if it's in the ground? What does it need? Naomi?
Water.
Okay, we got the water. There's something important. Xavier? Okay, the seeds are part of where we got the rose. What does your body need? Xavier, you want to try again?
Yeah.
Okay, we do need oxygen. Yes, we do need it. So what can we put in the soil to nourish it?
Water.
Ooh, we're stuck on water.
That's okay.
So this is great. They've got water and they've got sunlight, and I know that you're trying to talk to them about fertilizer and nutrients in the soil. Those three things are very, very important. But there's one more thing which is not very obvious. Actually, you might even say it's a little bit counterintuitive or a little bit surprising, maybe. There's one more thing you could do for your rose bush, which is surprising. Does that give anybody any hints?
Any?
I'm going to give them a second, then I have a guess.
Aha! Go for it, Joe.
What?
Take care of it and never let the birds peck on it.
So she said, don't let birds peck on it.
Well, that's really interesting because actually the birds might be taking the insects which are eating the rose bush. So actually the birds might be helping the rose bush by eating the aphids and the little things that eat the plant. So if you protected it too much from the birds, it might not help.
I'm going to take a guess.
I think Joe knows where I'm going with this one.
I'm going to say pruning, so cutting it back a little bit.
Yeah. Do you kids know what pruning means?
I doubt it.
Yes.
Do you know what it is? What's pruning?
Exactly.
You want to take a guess?
I didn't say that.
Oh, I thought you said yes.
Grass?
Hey, I heard it again.
Say that.
Say it again.
Joe knows. Oh, cutting grass?
Okay, so is it like cutting grass?
Yeah, it's a little bit. So you would actually clip off a little bit of your rose bush. So that's surprising because you're clipping some away. You're taking a little piece off. But actually what happens when you do that is it stimulates the rose bush to grow stronger. So actually pruning a rose bush is helping the rose bush to grow stronger. And this is really interesting, and it's because of the relationship with plants and animals. Rose bushes, in their history, they've got lots of animals that want to eat them. So they need to have a couple of responses. Thorns are one response, but also growing strongly after you've been nibbled at is another response. And it's the same with grass. So to the young man who said cutting the grass, yes, that's exactly right. When the bison eat the grass, actually the grass grows stronger. And that actually is very important for grasslands. So you actually need something like a bison to graze them, to make them grow strong and healthy. And of course, there aren't that many bison around nowadays. You could maybe go to Yellowstone, and for those of the students in Wyoming, it's kind of can go see some bison in Yellowstone. You can see some bison herds, but there's not many. In a lot of other places, it's actually domestic cattle that are performing that service of grazing the grass and making it grow strong. Which is very interesting. It's a little bit ironic, but it means that we have to work with people who take care of their cattle in order to help these grassland birds. So I'm just going to show you some pictures now. In part, it's to give you a sense of some of the birds that we're trying to save. These are and a chance to show you some of my photos of them, but also to show you just how amazing and beautiful they are. This chestnut-colored longspur I mentioned is endangered species. This is a Sprague's pipit. It's really good at hiding in the grass. This one, like the longspur, migrates down to Mexico. Come from southern Canada down to Mexico. Here's another one called the Baird sparrow. It also nests up in southern Canada and then migrates down to Mexico. Also a species we call it special concern, so it's losing its population. This is a really interesting one called the loggerhead shrike, which has also a grassland bird, although it likes to, sometimes it likes to use barbed wire or thorny bushes if it catches an insect or maybe even a small lizard, it'll impale them on the barbed wire. So some people call it the butcher bird for that reason. But it too is declining. This is a Ferruginous hawk and a beautiful big raptor of the grasslands. And actually this one even nests right on the ground because there's not many trees in the grasslands. Any of you kids know what this one is or recognize the family? If you guessed it's an owl, well done. And what do you notice about its legs?
Oh.
Huh? Oh,
Aiden?
nothing. Never mind.
Okay. Hunter?
You're puny.
They're puny, okay.
They are very small. That's a good observation, but the legs are quite long. You notice how long those legs are? And this is because they live a lot on the ground and they have to stand up and look over the grass. Or sometimes they like to use the fence posts for the same reason. And they're called burrowing owl because they actually nest in the holes made by badgers and other animals that dig holes in the ground. So they make their nest in the grass but under the ground using a badger hole. And they've, in Canada, the burrowing owl has lost, it's more than 90, it's close to 95% of its population. So, and then there's others that are not migratory. This is called the greater sage grouse. This is a very famous bird. It dances on something that we call a lek. These are males that are dancing by fanning their tail and puffing out their white feathers. And they have air sacs. They make a popping noise. And this is, probably inspired a lot of things like powwow dances and other things. This is a big, you could say a bird of the prairie, a chicken of the prairie. But this is a species that we call a resident species, meaning it mostly stays in the same area. It doesn't migrate down to Mexico. It just moves about in the prairie. And this photo I took in 2003 in Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan, but they're almost gone from Canada now. So how am I doing for time, Joel, actually?
Yeah, we can go for a few more minutes, Christian, then we'll do some questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna mention one more thing before we go for questions. And again, it's a question for the kids. So I want the kids to look at this image. This image is from Google Earth. And what you're looking at here is northern North Dakota, southwestern Manitoba, and southeastern Saskatchewan. If you need to see the border, you can look here. This is something called the Turtle Mountains in dark green. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you see that straight line along the Turtle Mountains, that is the border between the U.S. and Canada. So north of that line is Canada, and south of that line is the U.S. And my question to the kids is, what do they see? How would they describe this picture? What does it look like to them?
All right, Ms. Holden, we'll let you type in some answers too if your students want to tell us what they're thinking that they're seeing. Well, let's start with Ms. Frengen's group and see what they think they see.
Oh, hi. Okay, sorry. I thought we were going to Miss Holden. What do you guys see? What did you see?
I saw orange.
Summer?
Grassland.
Okay. Okay, grassland is what we saw. Xavier?
Grassland.
Same thing?
Okay.
Is there anything strange is there anything that looks strange to you or looks surprising to you?
Does something look strange to you? Okay. Yeah. Hunter? It was very pixelated is what he's saying.
You know what? And that's a brilliant observation because that's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah.
It looks like a bad photo that's really pixelated. But actually, this is a good photo taken from space. So why does it look pixelated?
So we had some of those same observations too. Miss Matson's group said it looked like a checkerboard.
Yes.
Ms. Holden's group pointed out the white dot. So why do we think we're seeing that kind of pixel look, that checkerboard look? Because I would think if we were looking at grasslands, we shouldn't see that. We should see kind of a nice, kind of uniform.
Yes, you would expect a sort of a soft green uniform. So why are we seeing all those pixels?
So Ms. Matson's group thinks cultivated property.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Very good answer. Very observant. I'm extremely impressed that all three classes made that observation. Because that's exactly what's happened. Basically, the prairie is, if you like, it's carved up into sections. Sections are 1 mile by 1 mile, and then each mile by mile is often in a quarter section, which in metric would be 800 meters by 800 meters. And some of them will be crop, some of them will be something else. Somebody will be growing potatoes, somebody will be growing wheat, somebody will be growing something else. But it is all carved up into parcels like that, private property or smaller operations. And that gives it this pixelated look. And that right there is a big problem for all of those birds that we just looked at, because what they have learned to live with for thousands and thousands of years is a big sea of grass. And they don't do very well when things are all little tiny pieces of grass. So these little pixels, that even though some of them are good habitat, some of them are good grass, and they have cows grazing them, so the grazing stimulates the growth and the grass grows strongly. But the problem is they're all small little squares. They're all small little pieces. And the result is that those birds don't do very well. Maybe they can still nest, but they have fewer young, or they're more vulnerable, or they get hit by cars, or they collide with power lines, or the predators, the hawks, and so on, are sitting on those power lines waiting for them. Or sometimes there's something called, there's a cowbird which actually lays its eggs in other birds' nests, and it's easier when the grassland is divided up like this. It's much easier for that cowbird to find the nests in the little tiny pieces of grass. If these birds are in the big sea of grass, they're completely hidden. In fact, you would hardly see them because they blend in so well, like that tippet photo I showed you. So this is what we're working to try to save, but this is just basically the problem that we're up against, is where so much of the prairie is already parceled up. There's not much big area left to work with. And so I think I'll leave it there, but we can get into the questions and we can see what direction the kids want to take this in. We can see what interests them, and we'll go from there. How does that sound?
All right, sounds good to me. Great presentation, Christian. Thanks so much for sharing with us. Beautiful pictures.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm pretty jealous seeing half of the world's bird species. That's pretty incredible. Pretty awesome.
Yeah.
All right, Miss Holden's group. They're in Spruce Grove, Alberta. They're joining us virtually. Miss Holden is representing them. Let's bring her into the call. Hey, Miss Holden.
Hi there. Great presentation. They're really enjoying it. A couple of the kids are wondering about how many of the birds are endangered in Manitoba and Alberta.
Yeah. Oh, that's a
area.
wonderful question. We have 64 in Canada. It's actually be a good chunk. Both Manitoba and Alberta would be in the 40s. They would be close to high 30s or low 40s each. I can check that on the public registry as we talk, maybe, and give you an exact answer in just a minute. But yeah, it's the number is increasing. When I first moved to Manitoba in 2000, it was only about 12, and now it's around 40. So it's definitely increased. And Alberta would be very similar. And the species between Alberta and Manitoba would be very similar, except for some of the Rocky Mountain birds that you get in Alberta.
And Christian, do you think that's pretty accurate, or do you think just, the nature of bird populations being spread out, it might actually be higher?
Yeah, well, sometimes we don't necessarily know. And actually, to be honest, there's a bit of a backlog in assessments. So we're working hard to assess, but there will be some more added over the next few years when we catch up with that backlog. So in reality, it's probably higher. Some of you may have heard about a paper that was published quite recently, which said that in North America, we have lost 3 billion birds since 1970. And actually, in the details of that paper, it's 1 in 4 of those birds that we've lost is a grassland bird. So they're a quarter of all of that loss. So it is quite significant. And even though the prairies seem like they're full of birds still, it's nothing like the description of what it was like 100 years ago.
All right. I'm going to bring Miss Frengen's class. They're joining us in Toronto. And they gave us the Great Rose answers. How are we doing, boys and girls?
Good.
Right. Who's got a question?
Anyone have a question?
Oh. Wait.
I'm curious about something if they don't. Okay, wait, I won't take their turn. Zane?
When did you start with interesting birds?
When did he start getting interested in birds? We want to know kind of the history of how and when you got interested in birds.
Well, okay, thank you very much for that question. I don't remember when, because I was a boy and I just love birds. I sort of, I was fascinated by the bit I did. Then I sort of kept some birds as pets, but then I decided I didn't really like that. I wanted to see them flying free and in the wild. But actually, I was, I went to university and did other things, and I was teaching for a while and traveling. And it was actually later on that I came back and I decided to go back to university when I was 26. And then that eventually led me to going on and doing a couple of degrees and eventually a PhD in environmental science. So birds have been with me my whole life in some way or another, but it was in my late 20s that they became, my research focus and my career, basically in my 30s and so on and so forth. So, yeah, maybe not a very precise answer, but that's the best I can do with that.
Yeah, well, I really liked what you said at the beginning, how you end your day and you continue doing, the same thing. I think that's good advice for any student, is if you can find a job where it's more of a passion and it doesn't feel like work, I mean, that is the ultimate, I think.
Yeah. I'm extremely lucky in that regard. So.
All right. Miss Matson's group is joining us. I'm going to bring them into the call. They're joining us in Green River, Wyoming. Miss Matson, if you want to turn the mic on, we'd love to grab a question.
Check here, let's see. Let's put that up so we can see your face. There you go. All right.
I was wondering how the cultivation of the grasslands affected the population of upland birds, like different species of grouse and quail.
Yeah, fantastic question. Well, it's very much, it affects them very much in the same way. I mean, essentially, when you turn a grassland into a monoculture crop, essentially that's habitat loss. And it doesn't matter if you're an upland bird like a sharp-tailed grouse or a migratory bird like a longspur. It's essentially habitat loss for you. So it affects them in exactly the same way. It represents habitat loss. In addition, for some things like the grouse, which are hunted, it means that they have fewer hiding places, perhaps, or again, it's that sea of grass that is now shrunk, so they're more vulnerable. They're squeezed into smaller places, which can mean increased hunting pressure, both from humans and from hawks and other birds as well. So, and mammal predators. So it affects them in very much the same way. And if you like to think about it as the structure, so if you have grasses in a native prairie and flowers, you have actually a very complicated structure. It's a bit like a forest, although it's in miniature. It's and the birds use different parts. They hide in the tall grass. They run around and catch insects in the open areas. They move in between the grass, and a lot of them are very brown in color, including the upland birds like your grouse and quail. And that brown color helps them to camouflage. The nest will be right on the ground in that grass, and it might be covered over with a tuft, but very hard to spot. Conversely, in a cropland, you've got it's too tall, dense. All the stalks, they don't have that variety. They don't have that. The fancy word is heterogeneity, but they don't have that ability to get all their needs in a cropland. So most of them just won't be in a wheat field. They won't be in a canola field or a soy field. They just cannot use it. So it represents a loss of habitat to them. And the more of that cultivation that happens, the less habitat they have. So
great question. Ms. Holden, I'm going to bring you back in, see if we've got another one from your students in Alberta.
Hi there. We're wondering about the owls that live in the grassland in Alberta. And you mentioned the burrowing owls, and they're everybody's favorite because they're so cute. Is there any other types of owl that are in the grassland as well?
Yes, there are. So burrowing owl is really the true grassland specialist in Canada, at least in the prairies. There's also something called the short-eared owl. And I don't know if I should have thought to have pictures and backup so I could show you. But there's also something called the short-eared owl, which likes marshland and sort of wet grassland a lot, will be in the pastures. It's a bit bigger than the burrowing owl. And as the name suggests, it has very tiny little ear tufts. Those are hard to see. In addition, there's the great horned owl. Now, most people will think of the great horned owl as a bird of the trees and the forests, but actually they do like that mosaic habitat, which is just a few trees. Like if you have a farmstead, they might be in your shelter belt, for example, or even actually in an abandoned barn or an old building, they can nest in that. So you can have, there's actually a lot of great horned owls on the prairies, short-eared owls in the wet prairies and the marshlands, and burrowing owls in the expansive grasslands. So those would be the main three. And then there are a couple of others. So one is called long-eared owl that will nest in coniferous trees. So if you get a little patch of conifers, it's possible that you would get something like a long-eared owl in there. And sometimes you'll find them in plantations or the like as well.
Okay, so I quickly grabbed a couple pictures.
So there's our short-eared owl. Someone's quicker on the trigger than me.
And then we got another friend there too.
And there's our great horned owl, which great horns really do have those big, long ear tufts. And the color varies a bit. So if you're in Alberta, actually Alberta is super interesting because especially the Calgary area has a bit of a mix. There's the very pale great horned owls of the prairies, which are almost white, very pale. And then there's some darker ones in sort of Calgary and west of Calgary. So you get a bit of a mix of dark great horned owls and pale great horned owls. And then I should mention, of course, there's the snowy owl as well. The snowy owl comes to the prairies in the wintertime. The snowy owl nests up in the Arctic of Canada, which the Arctic is a bit like a grassland. It's similar in that sense that the vegetation is very low, and that's their nesting habitat. And then they come down and they spend their winter getaway in the prairies. So we have lots of snowy owls in southern Alberta. southern Saskatchewan and southern Manitoba in the wintertime.
Okay. Toronto, do you guys have another question for us?
Okay, Hunter?
Since the hawks nest on the ground, do they suffer from deforestation?
I almost caught that. The hawk on the ground is...
Since the hawks nest on the ground, do they suffer from deforestation?
Well, they suffer from... Sometimes they suffer from other things, but not deforestation. So that bird, it's called the Ferruginous Hawk. The Ferruginous Hawk is a grassland bird, so it likes that open grassland. So it's actually the flip side. If you planted trees, it doesn't like it so much. It likes the big space of grass. So it very much needs the grassland, and the reason why it evolved to nest on the ground is because there are no trees, or there were very few trees in the prairies 100 years ago. When they do nest on the ground, though, they like a little ridge, they like a little high so they can see a bit further, so they're a little bit protected from things like black bears and so on and so forth. But and they will, if you put a basket in a tree, they will use it. So they don't always nest on the ground, but their main prey is ground squirrels. They love those prairie ground squirrels, the 13-line ground squirrels, the Richardson's ground squirrels, the Franklin's ground squirrels. If you're in the western part, there's also, of course, prairie dogs, but prairie dogs are very limited in their distribution in Canada. So they're hunting those in the grasslands and not in the forest. There are other hawks in the forest, of course.
Okay. Great question. We're going to visit Wyoming one more time. Let me bring them in. Do you guys have another question for us?
Has the number of species of waterfowl that migrate through the grasslands changed in the past 50 years due to cultivation and private property?
Another great question. I'm loving these questions. No, I wouldn't say the number of species has changed so much. There have been species that have been impacted a lot and come and gone a bit. So the trumpeter swan would be a very famous example of that. It was basically wiped out, but has come back in again in the east. The waterfowl were really down low, but the waterfowl populations have rebounded fairly well. There's a couple of reasons for that, at least in the prairie pothole region, that I'm most familiar with. So one is in the 1970s, we brought in the North American Waterfowl Conservation Act, and we've done a lot to try to restore wetlands, to retain wetlands. So there's a lot of dedicated funding for wetland retention. And the second part is actually since, at least in Manitoba, since about 1997 until around 2016, is we entered a really wet period, and we had a lot of rain for 20 plus years. And a lot of the shallow wetlands that had been ripped up started to refill again. So waterfowl populations in the prairie pothole region have done fairly well in the past 25 years. They're on the increase. There are a few exceptions, but on the whole, they're holding stable, and it's really the grassland birds that are suffering the most. Now, having said that, there are a couple of waterfowl like the northern pintail, which are upland nesting, and so your second question relates to your first question in that regard, and it tends to be the ones that are struggling a bit tend to be the upland nesting species for all of these same reasons related to habitat loss.
All right. Well, I want to share something really quickly here before we wrap up for today. For the classrooms who are joining us, if you check out Story Maps, you can find a little bit more about some of the migratory bird events that we've run this week and find some other cool resources to check out. I want to give a shout out to our live camera classrooms. Thank you so much for your awesome questions. Alberta, Toronto, Wyoming. Shout out to the groups on YouTube. And Christian, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us on World Migratory Bird Day. Thanks for sharing kind of the plight and the, what's happening with birds in grasslands and why that is important. It was great to see some of your photos. And I think you really made it make sense. That picture at the end where we saw that checkerboard, I mean, you can see the scale, across provinces and states about how much of the grassland has been lost.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much and awesome questions. So I really appreciate the questions and the interaction.
All right. Well, again, everybody, thanks so much for joining us for World Migratory Bird Day. You can check out our YouTube channel to see the other events from this morning as well. Thanks for joining us, and we're going to sign out for now.